Hello, my name is Maria Popova.
My name is Oksana Shevel. We wrote this book. It's called, can you see it? Here it is. Russia and Ukraine, Entangled Histories, Diverging States. And this book basically is an argument about the origins of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I guess we'll be talking about this book today, and we're happy to answer questions that you have.
What happened was that in 2022, in the beginning of the year, when things were escalating and there was so much discussion about whether there would be an invasion or not, we started writing short pieces to explain the situation and to push back against what we saw as really minimal, superficial knowledge of Ukrainian politics and the dynamics of it. Everybody was commenting only from the standpoint of international relations theories and what they say about when war happens, when it doesn't happen, what would happen if there were a full-scale war. All of these comments were based simply on international relations theories and sort of great power competition and all of that. And we felt that they were all really ignoring the realities on the ground in Ukraine. What we saw as basically very strong signals that Ukraine will resist vigorously if there were a full-scale invasion, that forcing Ukraine to abide by Minsk would be really counterproductive and would not lead to any resolution, but to de facto Russia winning this without having to invade. So we wrote these short pieces for Foreign Affairs and other outlets, and then the full-scale invasion happened, and the press actually came to us and said, well, why don't you develop some of these arguments in book format and just explain what led first to Russia's full-scale invasion, but also to Ukraine's vigorous resistance, which to us wasn't a surprise, but to many it was.
I think maybe we felt both kind of part of frustration, as you said, that some things that scholars who worked on Ukraine have known for a long time, have written for a long time, for example, the difference in political systems in Russia and Ukraine being more competitive and how that made a difference. And had all sorts of implications. That sort of part of the argument in our book is about divergence of political regimes. And also the fact that, Russia had long, and it became more kind of prominent under Putin's rule, had designs to destroy Ukrainian sovereignty, not just to, prevent some sort of security threat to itself, supposedly from NATO enlargement. So there was this sense of frustration, I think, as you talk about. But I would also say maybe this, at least, speaking for myself, I think we also felt that this is something that we can do as scholars, right? We are not military people. We are not going to pick up, a gun and fight in the war. We were not, activists who say had some capacity to deliver humanitarian aid. Or otherwise help Ukrainian democracy survive, but we felt that we could pool our expertise, our areas of expertise, and write a book about it, right? With a hope that we would be both educating people who didn't know much about the region and the war, and maybe hopefully changing the minds of some people who may have sort of grabbed onto the sound bites, like NATO, Russia doesn't like it, NATO bad, war is bad, but that's why Russia did it. So I think we were pushing sort of thought maybe to some extent as a public service almost, right? I don't know if Maria would agree with this, but I think we talked about it. And in a way, even dedication of our book, we dedicated to the children who were stolen by Russia from Ukraine. And, the dedication says we hope they come back to their families soon, because we both felt that not only this war is, as any war would be terrible, but this one was especially terrible. And some of the things that the Russian regime has been doing, including stealing the children from Ukraine, was really horrifying. So we wanted to, our book to raise awareness about these things as well. Because first of all, I don't think that they didn't sort of believe any of it, right? I mean, there were preparations being done, you know, some of the like planes were moved out of the, like, so they knew that, you know, Russia is going to do something. I think what maybe they didn't really, I mean, as you said, kind of weighing all the information, they said this possibility of the full-scale invasion seemed maybe less likely. And I think the reason it seemed less likely for Ukrainians, actually something that, you know, very central to our book, is because Putin did not really know the country. He had a certain image of it. And I think this notion that you can invade a country the size of Ukraine with the army size that, if I remember correctly, experts said was about the size of the army Soviet Union sent to Finland, it was just not enough to subjugate the country of this size. And I think this is was the reasoning was that they, you know, saying, and I think actually some Ukrainian spies even went to the location where all these troops were camped outside the border, and they came back and said, like, look, they just don't have enough people to overrun the whole country. So they were expecting maybe there would be like an invasion in Donbass to liberate Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, as opposed to this full-scale invasion. And then once it happens, in a way, Ukrainians proved right, because Putin did fail to overrun the country, right? Like, I mean, he couldn't just like march to Kyiv with his parade uniforms and like topple the government and have Russian troops met as liberators by these grateful Russian-speaking Ukrainians, and all of this nonsense that we knew at the time was sort of Russian imperial lens of looking at Ukraine. Ukrainians knew that we are not, and especially in the years since Euromaidan, became not what Putin says, you know, Ukrainians are. And I think this is where this kind of disbelief that he would really do this came from. And I think from the Western government side, right, because when they were expecting the invasion, much more of it wasn't sort of like, did the troops move? Like, when did they move? Like, where are they staying, right? And it was more sort of thinking like, what's behind it, right? It was more like, here we're observing on our satellite that these troops moved left and right. And, you know, therefore, sort of, it's logical that they would keep moving. And I think Ukrainians were looking at it not just from purely sort of technical lens, as in like, there are these groups of Russians camped on our border, but also like, what's the broader set of goals and how realistic are those goals? And I think that's probably why, and, you know, I don't know, Maria, if you know, want to add to it, or if you agree even, but I mean, I think that's, to me, it was like, yeah, like, I couldn't believe they're going to invade, you know, like, for these reasons. I thought it just makes no sense, like, invading Donbass, yes, but marching to Kyiv with that smaller, like, relatively small army size, and hoping for 3-day victory just made no sense.
But at the same time, the West really expected Ukraine to last 3 days, right? And even there were voices saying in early February, Western analysts saying, Ukraine might as well just preemptively surrender because they stand absolutely no chance. So why not just, you know, meet some demands, whatever Russia's demands are, in order to avoid this war? Coming from a complete misunderstanding of what the Russian demands were, that they amounted to full loss of sovereignty rather than just some territorial concessions or some innocuous power sharing, you know, using all kinds of euphemisms to describe Minsk as some innocuous power sharing, when in fact it was really a grab for Ukraine's sovereignty. So I think there was a lot of different types of misunderstandings to go around to all the actors really involved.
The book is not sort of, in that sense, your typical academic book when you go and, you know, interview many people and you spend some time in the archive, or, you know, look at some new body of evidence that hasn't been examined before. The book is really a synthesis, I think, of, and kind of pulling together of our two of our expertises. So we are building on decades of research that both of us have done. But the book itself does not sort of, you know, it synthesizes what we have learned. So it, you know, the parts that Maria wrote for the book, she was especially leveraging her, you know, research on judicial independence, on democracy, on the rule of law. The parts that I have written, leveraging the work I've been doing on identity politics, on citizenship and language. So in that sense, we try to kind of package, because we had a general reader in mind. I mean, the book is, people assign it for classes, we assign it to our classes. So it is certainly sort of has academic component to it, but it is also like our goal was to reach as broad a readership as possible. So we really tried. And, I can speaking for myself, can say that that's not easy as, an academic who used to write like many footnotes and sort of dense, maybe like nuanced, sort of navel-gazing type of analysis, to really write it in a very clear, accessible way, but without losing sight of, the depths of the expertise that we have developed and the knowledge that, we were pulling from our research into this book.
Yeah, absolutely. The book is more of an extended analytical essay that tries to bring together the expertise that both of us have on both Russia and Ukraine in the last 20 years or so.
Yeah, the identity story is a big part of the book. It's sort of one of the two kind of main lines of argument, we could say, because the book ultimately argues that what led to the war is growing divergence between Russia and Ukraine in several areas, and identity is one such area. So it's not like the law of identity, as in like there isn't sort of any one law. But what the book says has happened, and we do have, a short historical introduction, but primarily the focus is on the post-1991 period, is that over the starting already in the early 90s and continuing, up to this day, Russia and Ukraine gradually diverged in how they understood themselves and the other. And in Ukraine, this commitment to independence and becoming a sovereign state and, conception of distinct nationhood and distinct history have developed and grew over the years. And Russia was resistance to this. So exactly as you're saying, this notion that Ukrainians are really Russians has very long historical roots. And there was a resistance to this in Russia. And, in the 90s under Yeltsin, it was somewhat different story, although we do argue that already then this resistance to and accepting Ukraine as a sovereign nation and the state was challenging even for the liberal elites. And that certainly, in the Putin period, this what we call in the book re-imperialization has gained speed. And that's one, it's not the only reason, because our story, there is an interaction between identity politics and regime dynamics, and we also talk about foreign policy. But yes, to your question, William, identity story is a very important, especially divergence in understanding of itself and relations with the other, and this Ukraine's commitment to independence that grows over the time, and Russia's kind of resistance and reluctance to accept it, and kind of imperial perception of Ukraine as by right and history a part of Russia increases over time. And that's very important context for understanding ultimately the full-scale invasion.
Because in fact, in the beginning of the transition, Ukraine's economic hardship was even deeper than Russia's. Now, Russia, of course, had the benefit of oil revenues propping things up. But I think overall, we sort of overemphasize and overestimate maybe the argument that this invasion on the Russian side is motivated by fear. That fear of the ordinary Russians who are going to rebel for one reason or another. Because I think what we emphasize in the book is that over time, Russian political competition really declines, and Russian civil society does not, in fact, develop in the same way that Ukrainian civil society developed. So really the danger to Putin from whatever direction, whether due to economic conditions, due to the tightening dictatorship, I think all of these, while they're absolutely correct that Russians have reasons to rebel against this government, I think they overestimate the likelihood of that happening. There is not a lot, especially after 2012, not a lot of evidence that there was brewing discontent against the Putin regime among ordinary Russians. So I think the looting that we see happens because they realize that they're not well off compared to Ukrainians only when they get there. Their imperial lens of seeing Ukraine as inferior doesn't really allow them to consider that this was possible before seeing it with their own eyes.
My sense is that if you are sort of savvy enough to install like a VPN, you can still pretty much access, what you want. And, people who are more, like intelligent, like educated, familiar with computers, I don't think it's difficult. That's in a way sort of goes back to the point Maria was just making, that the Russian society was not, really, with the exception of some very small, very brave, but very small segment of the population, was not really, rebelling against regime in any way. And I don't think that would be for the lack of information, because yes, certainly, TV portrays the government line, but it's not difficult in today's Russia. It's not even like the Soviet Union where, there was no internet and 3 TV channels, and it was like difficult to get outside information from the outside. In Russia, it's available, like it takes a little bit of an effort, but, it's available. So I think it's, I think probably goes to show that's not something we discuss in the book that much, but I think this discussion, if it's Putin's war, if it's Russia's war, and if, the Russian people are really against it, but they're like so oppressed that they can't do anything about it. As you know, many Ukrainians don't take kindly to these arguments. And I think on balance, we don't really have evidence of sort of some brewing major discontent in the Russian society, and kind of, especially in the way that would pose a threat to the regime, as Maria said.
That really, it was a big motivator for us to writing this book, was to push back precisely against Mearsheimer's argument, which is disconnected not only from the deeper history, but from the immediate facts and history that he is discussing himself. It's very superficial, and in the book we show how the geopolitical divergence that did happen between Russia and Ukraine really cannot be the cause of this war, because it is in fact the consequence of it. It happens only after Russia first invades in 2014 that we see real steps by Ukraine to geopolitically diverge. Up until then, they are very tentative steps, very cognizant all the time of the Russian-Ukrainian relationship and respectful of it, and also with absolutely minimal support by the West. I mean, basically, we had a few overtures by the Ukrainian government over time to sort of balance between Russia and the West that were often rebuffed by the West. So the timeline of his argument absolutely falls apart. It just does not work with the facts.
Yeah, and I would just add to it, sort of, as kind of maybe wearing my professorial hat here for a minute, that I almost find it, I mean, not only obviously his argument is factually wrong and there is, evidence against it that doesn't fit it, and they don't really have any good rejoinder to it, because the evidence is the evidence, right? Like you can't, like you look at the opinion polls in Ukraine with less than 25% support of NATO, with the West not wanting to invite Ukraine, like everybody knowing this, Putin knowing this, like how exactly is NATO expansion was some sort of imminent threat to Russia. But what is really shocking to me as a social scientist, that how many of these people are completely like reluctant to acknowledge, right, and sort of like reflect on their beliefs and hypotheses and theories in light of this evidence. This is what we teach students. We say like, okay, here is an argument that says X caused Y, but if we actually look at the evidence and we find that in case like this, X actually didn't cause Y, and there was like A, B, and C that caused Y instead. As a responsible social scientist, we should say like, well, this assumption or this hypothesis actually does not work in this case, right? Like it may or may not work elsewhere, but it doesn't work in this case. But it's always shocking to me when I talk to, I've talked to a few sort of, realists, And they don't want to do this, right? They like say, well, we'll have to agree to disagree. I mean, it's okay to agree to disagree, but you also have to say like, these sets of facts that you're pointing to indeed do not fit my theory. And they just completely reluctant to say that. And I think that's both kind of, bad social science and just makes it for not very convincing set of arguments.
I mean, ironically, the biggest really falsification of their argument happened after 22, when Finland and Sweden applied for NATO membership. I remember that we said, well, when these two countries enter NATO and Russia doesn't invade, you'll take it all back, right? And the answers from realists at that time that I got on social media was, well, this will never really happen because it will be blocked. So then when these countries did join and Russia didn't invade, but in fact pulled back its troops from the border with these new NATO members, which are supposedly this great threat to Russia, their answer shifted to, well, Russia is now busy in Ukraine, and that's the only reason why it's not invading Finland and Sweden. So, with moving goalposts like this, if that doesn't, jolt them into realizing that the security Russia is afraid argument is wrong, I don't know what else will. I mean, it seems that the Biden administration, in fact, the plan was to not have a plan. That sort of the idea was, as you said, to keep Ukraine from losing, but also to keep it from winning, because they were very concerned about how Russia would take defeat. Now, with a different US administration, we'll have to see whether there's a change to this strategy. It looks like there might be, but we don't know exactly in what direction it would go.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I will just add that, as you mentioned, that in this sort of notion that the West, even though, it has been supportive, of course, of Ukraine, military aid has been critical of all of this, the support has not been sufficient. And more importantly, or maybe equally importantly, that at critical time, right, this is, I think, now the argument that is sort of gaining traction in Ukraine, that had in the fall of 2022, when Ukraine was sort of at the peak of its success, was liberation of Kharkiv, was liberation of Kherson, when Russia, kind of being bogged down with this mobilization and the people, flight from Russia, like if at that time, Ukraine received more aid, we would have been at different points now, right? Like Ukraine would have been much more successful, could have liberated more territory, Russia could have been defeated. And again, here by defeat, we don't mean the Ukrainian army marching to Moscow. It means restoration of international law, right? Like this whole notion that, how can we possibly contemplate Putin moving his troops from the territory he captured? Like, why shouldn't we contemplate this? It's not some sort of affront and assault on Russian power or its rights of a sovereign state. It just says, like, go home, right? Stay within your own borders. So I think that's, I'm sure historians of the future would debate this, and military historians would, could things have turned out differently had, especially in that critical time, kind of mid to late 2022, Ukraine received more substantial aid than it did.
I don't think we have evidence that Russia is willing to take this breather, which it would just be a breather. If there is some agreement on territorial concessions for now. I mean, I think all this talk is really premature, because all the messaging that's coming from Russia is that they think they're going to win this eventually, and so far they are somehow scraping through the capability to keep going. We don't know how long they can maintain this, but there's no messaging coming yet that they're willing to stop, even if it is to take a breather. Otherwise, I do, agree with you that there's no reason to trust Russia's goodwill and sort of that it will abide to any agreement, no reason whatsoever. If there is a stop, it would have to be backed up by Ukrainian capability to deter further invasion. That's why the emphasis from the Ukrainian leadership has been very, very consistent that Ukraine needs NATO membership in order to prevent future Russian invasions, which are guaranteed to come without serious security guarantees. But again, I think all of this is really premature. We're not at that point yet.
I would agree with this. I would further add that I think this, in a way, sort of this, maybe wishful thinking that Russia would just, is eager to settle, and as long as it gets to keep the territories that it has occupied, and as long as it has some promise that Ukraine is not going to be in NATO, that's sufficient. Like that's Putin is going to call it today and be happy with it. I think again it misunderstands like these sets of assumptions. I think rest on the misunderstanding of the causes of this invasion. Right? Putin did not invade Ukraine in order to grab another piece of its territory that, by the way, now is completely in ruins. Given how fighting has been going on in Donbass. Right, like it's not by accident that they went straight for Kyiv to decapitate the government, right? Like this so-called denazification, it means regime replacement and installation of some puppet regime in Kyiv. And if Putin gets to control another like X square kilometers of Ukrainian territory, and it doesn't accomplish this. And I think this is why, when he says that all goals of special military operation are going to be accomplished, I think it only goes to show that their designs on Ukraine go much deeper than just additional territorial grab or this just sort of Ukraine's foreign policy orientation. It is really about controlling domestic politics, controlling identity politics, essentially having a vassal state. That has been the case in 21, and that's still the case today. So, as Maria said, right, we don't know what the new administration will do. We sort of, what kind of security guarantees may or may not be offered to Ukraine, like how much of a deep waters trouble Putin is as far as how long he can really sustain it. That also goes to show with the country being as close as it is. I think people are kind of guessing, not fully guessing, but in part at least guessing sort of how much capacity Russia has left for this sorts of war when they're losing 1,500 people a day and a ton of equipment and rely on North Korea and all of this. But I think, as Maria emphasized, and I would emphasize that as well, that I think we have to be clear-eyed about the goals, the causes of this war, if we want to have some sort of, realistic scenarios about likely long-term peace.
And I think the European Union has been very united on helping Ukraine, not just, as you said, there are some exceptions, but overall, the level of popular and governmental support is quite high and quite stable. 3 years in, we don't see really a collapse of support in anywhere. The countries that started out with low support are maintaining that low support. Hungary being the notable example there. And I think there is a strategic realization within the European Union, within Europe broadly, that in order to guarantee European stability, the European Union will have to pursue what's now being called a geopolitical enlargement, that it has to help Ukraine, but also Moldova, potentially Georgia, if the protests produce some change in government there. But the European Union is now working with the realization that there will be no European stability without helping what is essentially these frontline countries of Europe that are holding Russian expansionism, helping them survive, but also helping them integrate into Europe.
Great question, which reminds us we need to finish this paper. We're actually trying to write a separate paper, kind of taking this theoretical piece from the book about the escalatory cycle and trying to develop it a little bit more kind of theoretically and kind of hypothetically, and then see exactly as you said, how does it apply, whether it applies to other countries in the Russia's periphery. And of course, we have different outcomes, right? Like in case of Russia and Ukraine, we have a growing divergence, but sometimes, let's say in Belarus, right, like Russia manages to subjugate Belarus. And, some countries like, Georgia, which was sort of, separating, but now the, current regime is more pro-Russian. And of course, Moldova is an interesting story, and also Central Asia, right? Armenia. So I think the short answer to your question is that we think it applies, but we may not be able to articulate sort of now, like how exactly it would apply to these other cases, because we haven't researched them in the same depths. But this is something that we definitely, is kind of like the next step in our collaborative work, stemming from this book, is exactly kind of a better articulation of this argument as a distinct argument, and then testing its applications to other cases.
I think the main thrust of the book is to make the general point that domestic political divergence between the two states is at the heart of, is the root cause of this war. And so anyone who wants to understand this better and not think of this war as just simply a result of geopolitical wrangling between Russia and the West, but wants to understand the in-depth causes of the war, should be reading the book.
Yeah, I agree. I would also say that I think our book has aged pretty well, right? Because the book is about the causes of the war. So in that sense, it's different from, say, many, like some of them really excellent journalistic books that came, out, and they may sort of follow the events of the war. And, but like some few years past, say the book is about 2022, but we are now in 2025, right? Somebody may say, well, like, what am I going to learn sort of other than facts, from something that happened 3 years ago? I think our book gives, in a way, sort of the way of thinking about this conflict, right? The way of thinking about Russia's goals, the way of thinking of incompatibility, between Ukraine's growing commitment to independence. How did it develop over the course of 30 years? It was not always there kind of in the same extent. How did, Russia respond? These questions that you raised, what about the importance of Russian authoritarianism? We talk about it in the book because we actually have an argument about the interaction between kind of identity politics and regime dynamics. So I would say that, it's still valid, meaning that actually somebody asked me recently, would you have, if you wrote this book now, would you have different conclusions? And I thought about it. I thought, what, I don't think so. I think the conclusions that we drew, when we wrote this book, it was like we finished writing in the spring of 23, right? So 2 years ago. I would stand by all these conclusions, and, maybe that's something that's, I think makes our book's longevity perhaps a little bit more than just sort of current events book.
One of the follow-ups, the common follow-up, is this extension that Oksana talked about how we can apply the escalatory cycle to a broader set of countries. In terms of our separate projects moving forward, right now I'm focusing on looking at the effects of the war on Eastern European democracies, because in the beginning, in 22, there was a sort of I had an optimistic sense that the clarity of Russia's threat is actually going to strengthen Eastern European democracies, because those countries that made it into the EU in Eastern Europe it would clarify for the electorates how well they have it and how they avoided the Russian threat by being safely incorporated into the EU and NATO. But I think there is some mixed evidence. Think of the fact that Slovakia now has a pro-Russian government. Think of the election in Romania. There are really interesting dynamics going on across Eastern Europe as a response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that's what I'm looking at right now.
Yeah, and I'm now working on a project with sort of my broader interest the specific project is actually on Ukrainian state's policies towards competing Orthodox churches, and especially sort of this Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchy, and this nexus between, you know, on the one hand, protecting national security and sort of this perception that something like a religious institution could actually pose a danger or threat to national security. But of course, this argument is very difficult to sell in a democratic kind of, within democratic norms of the freedom of religion and, guarantees for this important freedom. So I'm looking at kind of both in practice, how does the Ukrainian state weigh in these conflicting concerns, but also, you know, increasingly, and this is sort of a new area for me, I'm beginning to look at actually the international legal principles, and I'm realizing, and, you know, this is not that I have any conclusions at this point yet, but it kind of strikes me as really interesting that all of these provisions were written there is no, in other words, there is no difference between countries at peace and countries at war, right? So there are these kind of broad things that countries are supposed to provide and guarantee, but then what if there is, you know, danger to national security? What if there is propaganda, like sort of these fuzzy terms, right? Like we're thinking of hard security as in like there is a battleship in my, you know, near my coastal waters. But what about these more kind of ubiquitous threats to potential security and the democratic system, and then this paradox that then democracies still have to guarantee certain rights, and how does sort of is this being navigated in Ukraine at present, but also sort of how can we think about international legal standards and how they came about, and, you know, whether we should have some sort of more allowances or not exceptions necessarily, but at least acknowledgement that it may be different dynamics for countries that are stable and at peace and don't have these kinds of threats that Ukraine faces. So that's something that I'm really looking into now.
I think we covered a lot of ground.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. Bye.
До побачення.